All right. Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Drew Zavatsky. I'll be your, I guess, your talking head today for the next 40 minutes or so. I'll be talking about the supplier diversity policy that the state has created for state agencies to use. But before I get going with my presentation, I did have a question, and I've been told that you can use the raise hand function to respond. So I'm seeing that there's approximately 30 people in this webcast. Can you please raise your hand if you are an employee of one of the state of Washington's agencies? Let's go ahead and raise your hand if you're an agency employee. And I can't see the voting, so I'm not sure. Okay, please stand by. 13. Okay, great. And then raise your hand and please put your hand down now. Oh, and this is a reminder too to please mute because sometimes there's background noise and we just don't need that right now. Now raise your hand if you are an employee of another government function other than for the state. So city or county or like a water district or so on. Go ahead and raise your hands. Just one. Okay, great. And by my count, then there's over a dozen of you who work for a private company. So if you are privately employed, go ahead and raise your hand. Just one. Okay, great. If I didn't mention what you are employed as, go ahead and send us something in the chat so that we can have a sense of who our audience is when we check back later in the presentation. Okay, I'll get started. If I can, let's see. Aha, great. Okay, so the supplier diversity policy exists. It requires state agencies to change how they do business because quite frankly, up until now, we have not been doing a great job with including small and or veteran-owned businesses in the groups that we actually do buy goods and services from. And that's something that we want to improve on. This policy represents a key milestone in our state's efforts to create real and durable change in how we procure goods and services, and inclusion of small and veteran-owned businesses will help to expand
There.
Whoops. Sorry. There we go. Okay. Great. Thank you very much for your help. So yeah, the basic idea has been that it's been unfair the way that we have worked with state businesses up until now. And quite frankly, there's been disparities in how we've done that work. And it has ended up harming a lot of our small and veteran-owned businesses. We want to stop that. So the new policy applies to all state government agencies. It also applies to higher education agencies in Washington state, as well as other types of institutions in Washington that procure goods and services on behalf of the residents of the state of Washington. Okay, so of course now I, okay, let's see if we can get this going. Okay. Skipped a slide there. Hang on. What is going on? Please stand by. Okay, there we go. All right. Pretty straightforward goals for the policy. The first is to remove barriers that prevent those small and veteran-owned businesses from getting equitable access to the money that the state wants to spend to get their jobs done. They also, or the goal is also to support and enhance the practices found in the governor's subcabinet, tools for equity in public spending. And looks like we have another question here. Please stand by. I think it's that one. Yeah, there we go. There we go. Okay, so yeah, that should you can track with my slideshow now. So, and then the third goal is to implement the recommendations made in the 2019 disparity study that the state of Washington conducted. And the disparity study was designed to try to find out whether or not there was such a thing in the state as unequitable spending. And it turned out that the answer was an undiluted, absolutely yes. There was, on many different scales, many different measures, we were not spending state money fairly across the state. And you could look at it, Eastern Washington, not fair. Western Washington, not fair. This type of community, not fair. That type of community, not fair. So the disparity study had about 15 or 16 different recommendations for how to try to right our ship and make things more fair. And we have adapted almost all of them. That's what this table shows. Basically, between DES and its partner, the Office of Minority and Women Business Enterprises, another state agency, we have addressed 15 of the 16 different topics. And we are working closely together with OMWE and the Governor's Office and the Office of Equity, as well as the Department of Veterans Affairs, to address the disparity and try to get more fairness into how the state acquires its goods and services. Okay, let me get to the next slide here. Hey, there we go. Okay, so why are we doing this? Well, because diversity, in particular supplier diversity, it adds value to what the state does. It increases innovation across the state enterprise. It leads to uncounted quality improvements in how all the state agencies meet their missions and acquire their necessary goods and services, leads to efficiencies, and absolutely leads to cost savings. The policy itself has many required actions for agencies, for the state agencies. It leads to removing barriers to trade, leads to enforcing good faith efforts to implement the policy. And it's used to address improvements in all aspects of government. Now, there's been criticism over the past, we're talking years past, that whenever there's been an effort to improve, it's been either not good faith or not comprehensive or not applied fairly or equitably. This policy is designed to meet all of those concerns and address all those needs. So, oops. There we go. Part of why we think it's going to work is that, and this is, again, at the governor's request, as well as what we were hearing from all of our stakeholders, whether it's state employees, members of the public, private industry, other public entities, all of them have said that there is a change that we could do in implementing this policy that can improve the chances that it will be successful. And that change is to involve leadership in an active role, not to give this to leadership for them to say, oh, okay, you employees down the line, you take care of this and then I'll blame you if it doesn't happen. No, the clear message was active involvement by our leadership in implementation. And that's exactly how the policy has been written. And part of that is that each agency leader is required by the policy to designate someone to basically be a project manager for increasing diversity and small business and veteran-owned business spend within the agency, and that they are supposed to, under the policy, reply and report each year on the success of their efforts to their leadership. So as a part of that also, everybody is required to be trained under the policy, including agency leadership. So it's not just an exercise in checking out, you know, it's like, oh, okay, we're doing this. Yes, yes. Oh, absolutely. I'm making all of my staff do it, but I'm not touching it according to the policy. Well, actually, yes, Mr. or Miss Agency Head, you also need to participate and are directly involved in the effort. So let's move on. You know, what'll happen is by the time I get to the last slide, I'll be able to figure out how to actually use the slideshow. So there we go. Okay, so implementing the policy, you know, part of why there are 10 tools here to use, and not all of them are necessary to be used in each circumstance. It's sort of, you know, it's designed so that the tools are there so that if you need them for a particular solicitation, there they are. But if it's not relevant, so it's not relevant. You don't have to use it. But they're 10 because, you know, it's easier to remember 10. We all have 10 fingers, 10 toes, hopefully. And that's, in my simple-minded way, why I put in that mnemonic device. So they address the categories as shown, forecasting, outreach, and so forth. The reason that 3 of these are color-coded green is that those areas were actually training sessions that were operated and led by the Office of Minority and Women Business Enterprises. All of the others were led by DES. Now, we all, that is DES and OMWBE, participated in all of 10 of these. However, you know, 3 were led by OMWBE. So if you're looking for what happened at those, if you did not attend them, you can go on the OMWBE website, look up supplier diversity training sessions, or for them, tools of equity training sessions, and they'll pop right up. The remaining ones, same thing, but on the DES website. And yeah, okay, let me get to the next slide, and hopefully this time it'll work. Nope. Oh, there we go. Okay, so this is just another way of looking at those 10 areas, but I'll talk about them with some specificity next. When it gets to the first tool, all agencies were to publish their forecasted purchases of items, whether goods or services, that were going to cost over $20,000 for next year on their own website. The due date for that was October 1st, and apparently they've all happened. If, you know, they're going to happen. If they're not in compliance, then so be it. They, you know, they'll have to explain to us when we do their procurement risk assessment why they didn't comply. And that may or may not have some impact on their delegated authority. Probably will, but that's to be determined at a later date. But that's the first one, publish, you know, and you can now look at several other agencies' websites to see what is forecasted for their purchases in the next year. The place where we're headed with this, we're not there now, but we hope to be soon, is a single location for all the forecast reports to be located so that vendors can go to a single place, put in their search terms that they care about, and then find their opportunities for commerce across all participating agencies. So that's where we're headed. The next one is the conducting target outreach. Every competitive solicitation must have some targeted outreach, which at a minimum requires a web search. There's many more details to this. Again, I invite you to take a look at our online description of that training session. There are 3 documents that talk about the targeted outreach and the DES site. They'll include a PowerPoint slide deck, as well as a transcript of the meeting and a Q&A associated with that meeting. Third, attend an outreach event. So it's not enough to do targeted outreach, but it's a good idea too to make sure your agency is participating in one of those outreach events. Why? Because it's a version of what a friend of mine assures me is like speed dating. I don't know what that is because I've never done it, but there you go. Maybe I'm oversharing now. But the bottom line of what these are is you go in as an agency and it's very clear that you've identified the various needs that you're going to have, whether it's in your forecast report or in the presentation that you made prior to the outreach event, that then vendors can review, and then they will meet with you and they will talk about how they can meet your needs, maybe how your needs need to be updated because the vendors will have much more current information about the best ways to meet your needs that maybe, and oftentimes it will be news to you and your agency. So that's part of why this is a requirement. And I guarantee you that this requirement was put in place because the vendor community said that DES is not doing a great job with getting the word out. So vendors oftentimes are not aware of the state's agency's needs at a time when they're free, when they have capacity to fulfill orders. So this is designed to fill that gap and to meet that need in the vendor community. Unbundling solicitations, it used to be that many state procurements, let's say I had a widget that had 40 different component parts, right? And I just wanted to go to the, big widget maker, Nokia or whatever they were, and to say, yep, I just want, X thousand of your widget. Well, the vendor community says, now, wait a minute, Nokia ends up doing a lot of commerce with us to purchase a lot of the parts of that, so can't you unbundle that so that you're not just seeking that one thing, but that actually maybe you're seeking 15 different things, and many of them can be fulfilled by small and or veteran-owned businesses. So please unbundle. That was their request to us. We think it's a great idea, so we put it in the policy. Next one is create or reward sheltered markets. This is again a way of saying, hey, look, maybe there's a lot of smaller veteran-owned businesses who can fulfill the state's needs in ways that are much better than, for example, the Googles of the world. But because of the lack of opportunity that's expressed in what a sheltered market represents, they haven't been even thought of. So this is an experiment. We're putting it in place. Elena, who's following me, will talk a little bit more about this one. But again, this is another example of us providing a tool to agencies that can help increase the amount of commerce that we have or that we conduct with the small and veteran-owned businesses. Okay. Couple more requirements. There's the requirement to host pre-bid conferences and increase the bid period to 45 days for all complex solicitations, because, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but, because small businesses are small, so they have a hard time learning about potential, opportunities. Hence, the pre-bid conferences are designed to allow that to happen. And because they're small, they can't do turnaround with a solicitation as fast as the mega corporations who hire sometimes several FTEs to simply respond and create responses to competitive solicitations. So they suggested 45 days, and we said, okay, we'll give it a try and see how it works. So there it is in the policy. Now, with all that being said, I'm a lawyer. In talking to any lawyer that it says, "Oh, Drew, what does complex mean?" I'll give the lawyer response, which is, it depends. And that's absolutely true, because sometimes complex is very clear from its context and you know exactly what it means. Other times it's like, I don't know. Well, guess what? Sometimes that means that the agency ends up calling me and saying, hey, Drew, look, we're going to do a solicitation. We don't really think it needs a 45-day bid period. We think maybe 30 days will be plenty, but is this a complex one? And I've gotten a couple of calls like that, in the last couple of months. And the answer is usually, yeah, well, it depends. Some, yes, others, no. And, but know that that's out there, and know that, the intent is to increase commerce with those smalls and with those veterans. So there we go. Now, reduced limit, what does that refer to? That refers to the language being used in solicitations and or contracts. Some boilerplate language in the past had really onerous insurance requirements that really preclude selling to small and or veteran businesses, because it precludes their even bidding. If I'm going to bid, or I want to bid on something, but it requires me to file $1 million bond for vehicles when there's no vehicles included in anything having to do with this widget, that's unfair and unnecessary. And yet it precludes any smalls or, veterans to bid. So that's why that was put in there. And same with insurance requirements. Sometimes I just said it bottom, but maybe I was saying insurance, I don't know, but they're equal and they're very similar considerations. If you're requiring excess insurance, it's just precluding some people from bidding. And if you're requiring too big bonds or too expensive bonds, same effect. So, we strongly suggest against those. And then the other one is inappropriate experience or qualification minimums. We had an example of a solicitation that went out with an agency that had been in place for only 3.5 years, but it required bidders to have had 20 years of experience working with that agency. So, what? Yeah, so there you go. So that represented an area in which to improve, because it's one of those things where, maybe you have a legitimate need to go for the qualifications, important qualifications in a particular, say, service. But there are much more elegant ways to be able to distinguish the bidders that you really like and want versus the ones who really aren't qualified or you don't need to work with. So this is an invitation to do more critical thinking. Yeah, so there we go. And a couple more. Sometimes there are preference points that are allowable. However, you can't do preference points if what you're doing is going to be funded by federal dollars, because there are a lot of federal rules and laws that preclude preference points of any form if the feds are there. This is covered actually in the exceptions part of the policy. It's section D of the policy, but just as a heads up, that's part of what we're talking about. And then similarly for subcontractor inclusion plans and reserved awards. And yeah, I'm going to pause right there and put in a plug for Elena, because she's going to address these with some specificity. But I noticed that we have a question in chat, so let's take a pause. Go ahead. What? Oh. Yeah, I can. Okay, hang on. Oh, here we go. Does the policy extend its inclusion to people with disabilities? That is a really interesting thought. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. So I'm going to need to take this under consideration. Do you, let's see, Sadia, can you tell me a little bit more about policy extend its inclusion to people with disabilities?
Sure. I'm brand new to Washington state government, and so I don't know all the ins and outs yet.
Okay.
Been here less than a month, um, but I am the digital accessibility manager for ETS within DES, and I'm just, I don't know whether the state of Washington considers disability-owned businesses to fall under minority-owned, because that is another group that has been historically marginalized, but it's farther from being recognized as widely as ethnic minorities, women, veterans, et cetera. So I was just curious.
Yeah, you raise a great point. I know that oh my goodness, I'm going to forget the name of the law, but the law that sets forth protections for different types of entities includes the disabled. And I apologize if that was an offensive way of expressing it, but in effect, that's one set of laws. But right now, this policy is for doing commerce with, and the carve out that we're focused on here is doing business with small and or veteran-owned businesses. And the reason is that this is part of a larger legal strategy, because what we're looking at is way back when, about 20 years ago, there was an initiative in the state, I-200, where it basically precluded the state from using any preferences that are based upon traditional categories of people who had been affected by the law and that had been protected, right? So specifically, it was designed to eliminate protections for women, protections for minorities, et cetera, right? Well, that's fine. I guess that's what the voters wanted. That's what happened, and that's where we are. But what we're looking at now is, okay, what are the content neutral areas where we can promote commerce and promote broader use of state funds that don't involve traditionally protected categories of persons. Now, and I believe persons with disabilities are regarded as one of those, right? However, the reason that we're focused so much on small businesses and veteran-owned businesses is they're not protected categories, right? Now, I mean, as an aside, maybe there's a very high percentage of women and minority-owned businesses that are small businesses, but our categories are designed to be content neutral. And it's a necessary step in leading to either we're going to increase the spend across all categories, and great, we're done. We've done what we needed to do, or it doesn't work, in which case we can then seek to create a new policy, which will lead to a new lawsuit, by which we say, okay, we have done everything we could to try to create content neutral change that results in broadening spend, but none of them work, right?
Thank you. And I think there was actually somebody who asked a question before me. Adele, I think, had a comment.
Okay. Oh, scroll up. Okay. Okay. I'm hopeless. Okay, here we go. How do you ensure historically marginalized communities know about opportunities? The Bidders Conference can help with questions about the application RFP. I'm curious about the step prior to this. I run a grant program and I'm keen to do better at ensuring we have a broad applicant base. Yeah, it's a great question. all of the solicitations by law in Washington state, where they're competitive, have to be published in the state's, in the Washington electronic bidding system. It's called WEBS. Now, many vendors are registered in WEBS. And one of the great things about WEBS is that it automates notification of a new solicitation. So let's say I'm going to solicit for widgets, right? And I'm aware of several different categories of business codes that have to do with the widgets. You know, some have to do with ball bearings, some have to do with, you know, titanium, whatevers, and right. And many solicitations for goods or services, when they are posted in WEBS, will have multiple identifiers as saying, this is, if you work in this area, this is a solicitation that you should be interested in. And we invite you to bid that way. And so what ends up happening is, as soon as I publish my solicitation in WEBS, those notifications of my solicitation go out to everybody who's ever said in WEBS, I'm interested in those titanium bearings, for example. Right? This happens all the time. And you can actually tell from looking in WEBS, as someone who's a WEBS user, how many people have looked at your solicitation, how many people have downloaded your requests, right, and your documentation. And then you'll also see that there are bidders who are there, because that's also, I believe, right, Elena? That's tracked in WEBS bidding, yeah. So the fact is, WEBS is a very powerful system already. Now, to your point, we are always out there encouraging people to get registered in WEBS, because it is the most efficient way to connect bidders with sellers or solicitors, right? People issuing solicitations. It's not the only way, but it's the best way, because guess what happens? If I put out a solicitation and you get interested in a solicitation, but you're not registered in WEBS, any updates I have to that information only goes out to the people who are registered in WEBS. So there you go. And we're constantly seeing upticks in the numbers of people who are solicited, who are registered in WEBS. So I think that's the answer I had. Okay, so let's go back to, now we're talking about WEBS. Post-award documents like bid tabulations and awarded contracts and all of that are also going to be available in WEBS. Agencies are asked to post them there. So that is also going to be available. They're also being asked to post them on their website and or have them available at their headquarters for review. So the fact is, there's so many different moving parts through the whole process, but we are trying to increase the likelihood that a small or veteran-owned business learns about an opportunity, finds out about a solicitation, is able to bid, and therefore more likely actually win a bid. So, okay. Now I said there's a lot of moving parts. The reason we created a checklist, which is right here, is that the moving parts are not just the ones for the supplier diversity policy created by DES. There are also moving parts over at OMWBE in their tools for equity. This checklist is included in our handbook. Actually, is a great device for making sure that all of the requirements are met, because it actually lists all of the requirements that both DES and OMWBE are going to be tracking. The nice part about this is that the checklist is an interactive document, and the right column there with all the icons, if you click on the icon, it takes you to, if it shows the wavy lines, which is the icon for OMWBE, it takes you to their website with the relevant portion for where the icon is located. If it's the library book, that's to DES, same thing. So yeah. Now, there are two checklists when you look in the handbook. Checklist 1 is for agencies that are subject to Executive Order 2201. 2201, the governor, he basically said commerce for equity, equity contracting is a value of state government. And he basically put out all of these requirements for all of his large agency and small agency cabinet members, as well as certain other agencies that are subject to his direct control. In the same executive order, he invited all other state agencies and entities to participate with his requirements, because he believes, and it says in the executive order, this is his way to attempt to right the ship of government and to overcome, several centuries of, basically racist disfavor of many Americans. I mean, we're in a PEAR conference, so call it for what it is. It's designed to be part of the movement of state government to become a more anti-racist society. So, okay. Yep, talked about that. And move forward. This is just a brief discussion of some of the ways that we at DES are trying to do things a little differently. I'll leave to Elena to talk about how we are issuing draft RFPs and why. I'll put a shout out though to using the Apex Accelerator. This was the Procurement Technical Assistance Center, and they are a nonprofit organization that fulfills a critical need, which is that the state of Washington cannot assist potential bidders with how to win a bid, right? Because that means that's actually unfair advantage. However, we know that a lot of small or veteran-owned businesses could use some help, because our system is kind of, complex and can be daunting for someone who's not used to it. Well, guess what? That's exactly what Apex does. In fact, their whole mission is to assist the small and or veteran-owned business to get better, to create better responses to bid to win contracts with the state. So it's a great resource to have, and we send people to them all the time. Let's see. Also, another resource that is out there is if you want some assistance, we have 2 different versions of consulting services for the state. We've got the statewide contracts, contract liaison services. I believe they're called now the strategy team. Is that right, Elena? Procurement consulting group. And they're fantastic. I asked them for advice myself, And then we also have the small agency procurement service group also at DES, and they specialize on providing advice and, quite frankly, drafting solicitations and potential contracts for agencies that have 50 FTE or smaller. And at the very end of this, I say, how do I keep track of compliance? And that's actually, that's kind of a gimme, because the checklist is exactly how you do that. So with that, I think, yep, there's our partners, ONWBE, Department of Veterans Affairs, and the Office of Equity, as well as the Governor's Subcabinet on Business Diversity. Well, all of us actually report on different aspects of trying to move the needle from where we've been to, broader and more fair spending with small and veteran-owned businesses. So with that, I'll open it to questions. All right. Well, in that case, what we're going to do is we're going to take a 5-minute break. We'll do a switcheroo around different PowerPoints, and then you'll see Elena, and she is going to address the things that I didn't understand. No, I'm kidding. Yeah. All right, great. All right. And she'll be with you in just about 5 minutes.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me and can you see my screen? We'll do some first checks first. If you're not seeing the screen and if you can hear me, please let me know. Yes. All right. Perfect. Thank you guys for helping us out. Obviously, we've been testing out some technical things around here. So my name is Elena McGrew. I am a procurement manager at Department of Enterprise Services. Thank you so much for being here today, a late afternoon, and for sticking around for part 2 of the presentation today. My pronouns is she, her, and if you're not seeing myself right now, I'm a mid-30s, fair skin, brown hair. Just a quick description. I'm really tall in person, but you can't tell right now, I'm sitting down. So you heard in the first part of the presentation, Drew talk about the policies, right? And sort of kind of the laws and the legislator around what we're trying to accomplish. I'm here today to talk more about the operational side of things, right? And our team within the Department of Enterprise Services, we have these 2 groups, right? Drew and his team, policy team, is responsible for those policies. And then our teams, we're actually just like at your agencies, are responsible for trying to figure out how to implement those policies, right, successfully and comply with them, and how to make the procurement go smoothly. So today, I'm here to share the operational part of what we're trying to do. And so the main purpose, things that I'm going to be focusing on today is kind of share our journey at our agency, and hopefully it will benefit what you're doing at your agencies. And then also leverage and hopefully share some lessons learned, things that we've had to learn the hard way at our agency, or things that we've heard from other agencies just through our sort of procurement community, right, professionals. We're also going to share some tools after we checked with our moderators, and we'll be able to share a link and or tools that I'm going to be talking about today after the presentation. So via email, we should be able to get those to you if you're interested in using some of them or implementing some of them at your agency. So our journey, one thing that I'm really proud to say that I work at Department of Enterprise Services is that we were trying to implement some of the things that right now became a policy, a statewide policy, even before the policy came to life. So we were piloting, experimenting with some of these things, taking some risks, I guess, good risks, justified risks, and it was some of them work out, some of them didn't, right? But we had some good lessons learned for that. And so a lot of what you see in the policy and in the handbook that Drew was talking about was actually something that we've kind of tested and already had with our contracting teams at Department of Enterprise Services. So what we talked about when we kind of started on this journey is creating more modern, custom, sort of streamlined tools to use for our competitive solicitation, and that includes evaluation process. So we tried to focus on, historically, we've had some templates for competitive solicitation that were they were really long, they were confusing, there's a lot of different attachments, right? And so the goal for us, or something that we had in mind, is that how do we make it as user-friendly as we can for our business community to participate with us, right? We know that we hear from businesses all the time, especially small businesses, it's hard to submit bids because there's so much that we're asking for. And a lot of it, we have very I would say, little control over, because as you know, I'm sure some of you know, public procurement is a very regulated field, right? There's a lot of rules that we have to follow. There's this certain clause that we have to include, or there's this certain question that we have to ask. And there's more and more that is put in place, whether it's through policy, executive orders, or new bills that are coming out. And so one thing that we are focused on is through our tools is that how do we make them as user-friendly, as short as possible, concise and clear for our bidders to be able to be successful and hopefully engage with the state more. The other thing that we're kind of talked about and try to figure out is finding a right balance between experimentation and those standard tools and processes, right? So we have a very extensive, we call it desk manual, but it's a standard operating procedures at Department of Enterprise Services that kind of captures, right, a lot of guidelines, best practices for each step of the way through the solicitation process. There's technically 18 milestones that we go through in that, but we're all through that process, we're also trying to encourage our staff to find ways that and different things that can work, sort of experiment and try things that work for a certain commodity, for a certain procurement project. And so where possible, finding that balance between, okay, for the ease of our stakeholders, evaluators, subject matter experts, and bidding community, how do we use standard tools, or standard as possible, so they know where to find things and things look the same? And we're also trying to extend that not just within our agency, but to other agencies, encourage other agencies to use the tools that we're preparing. So again, for bidder, whether it's Department of Enterprise Services bidding, or Department DSHS or DOT doing a competitive solicitation, right? They are seeing similar formats, similar documents. They know how to respond, right? It just makes things so much easier. And so we're trying to kind of expand that enterprise wide for the state. But that experimentation, where appropriate, right, testing out new things that can improve supplier inclusion, supplier diversity inclusion on our projects. And then the other key point I would mention is we're starting to track, right? And there's a lot of questions in our last session about how are we tracking the results? How are we knowing that what we're trying to implement or what we've been implementing making a difference? And I'll speak to it a little bit more, but we're still somewhere on that journey of trying to figure out what are the right metrics to measure. How do we sort of keep track of if things are working or not? And it is a journey. It is something we're still learning. So can I actually ask really quick before I go into this, because I've been doing public procurements for many, many years. And so I am a self-proclaimed procurement nerd, and this can get very technical very quickly when it comes to procurement. But if you could raise your hand, if you're still here and paying attention to us today, if you can raise your hand, if you are in your day-to-day job, deal with procurement. So like whether you're leading procurement or directly assisting procurement folks, and you're pretty familiar with the procurement practices at the state. If you could raise your hand if you are in the procurement field or closely related procurement field. Do we have a number of hands raised? 8. Okay. Okay. So I will do my best to try to sort of start with maybe or speak to just the baseline when it comes to procurement process, rather than going too technical and too deep, just so we can have a good conversation, because it sounds like only a portion of us are focused on the procurement work. So to start with, sorry, just tapped my mic. There's kind of 3 main stages that go into a competitive solicitation process, right? There's stage 1, market research and outreach. Then there's stage 2, where you kind of take what you find out through the market research, and you try to create a strategy for your competitive procurement, and you draft the competitive procurement documents. And then the final stage, where you evaluate the bids that are received, and proceed to the contract award. So those are the three kind of main stages that we're going to talk about. And the reason it kind of hopefully helps you think about it is that supplier diversity inclusion, right, in our efforts in this area, they really are not just in one of these stages, right? They start from the early beginning and early decision of us to having to know that we have to do a competitive procurement, and kind of weaves through all these stages, right? It's the little things through the whole process that can make a big difference, right? So it's not just in one stage. And I'm going to try to talk about each of those three stages and what are the opportunities to hopefully help increase supplier diversity inclusion. So stage one, market research and outreach, right? So one of the things that we try to work and implement here at Department of Enterprise Services is conducting market research for every sort of competitive solicitation, the basics of understanding what is the commodity that you're buying, right? Or the service or the good, kind of knowing the basics about the industry. We have internally, we have a tool that has some prompting questions, right? To help people just think about like what are some of the common things to think about and Google and research, right? Online. To have that basic understanding. But it also involves identifying who are the businesses out there, right? Identifying the businesses in a certain industry and then using them, right, for that market research. And so the tools for market research and outreach was one of the things that we implemented not long ago to help us, right, identify the businesses, reach out to them, whether it's listening sessions or email asking questions, and not just the businesses we've historically done business with. So like incumbent, basically vendors that maybe historically were large businesses everybody knows, but also identify those small businesses, local businesses, certified businesses that we can reach out to and ask those questions, right? How can we make the procurement work for you to bid, right? For how can we invite you to engage and participate with the state? This is English is my second language. Sorry, I forgot to mention that. And you see the typo in the slide right there. It's not access. It's supposed to be assess the opportunity of subcontractors. That is one of the key points of market research as well, is that assessing if there's an opportunity in the industry to have subcontract, or if the industry utilizes subcontractors, and if that is the case, right? There is tools, and Drew kind of mentioned it about the policy. Policy has subcontractor inclusion plan, right? So if that market research shows that there is engagement and opportunity for subcontractors, that drives your decision at the strategy stage, right, to include that subcontractor inclusion plan. So that is one of the things to kind of think about in this research stage. Implementing the new, the search and outreach guidelines. So at DES, we started with basically creating a tool or a checklist or a little guideline about downloading the report from WEBS. Drew mentioned WEBS, right? Our statewide electronic bidding system where businesses that are interested in doing business with the state have to register. And so downloading the report of any businesses that are in WEBS, downloading a report and searching OMWBE and finding those certified businesses that are in that particular commodity or service, right, field that you're looking to solicit. And then we save those reports, and we use those reports and that information to whether it's email outreach, phone outreach sometimes, depending on the situation and options. And then later down the line, like for some solicitations, we keep those folks updated throughout the process as we can, in addition to things that we do as minimal requirement in WEBS, right, through WEBS where everything is posted. So we, based on our the input that we received from Attorney General's office, they confirmed that we can do that additional extra outreach, right, for small businesses, right, because it is something that, we're not giving them a preference. We're not helping them bid, right? We're just helping them get the information. I think kind of alludes to the question that Drew received earlier, like how do we just increase the engagement, right, from some of those small and certified businesses, and targeting this, doing this target outreach to them is one of the things that we're trying to improve on that. Attending outreach events, we have an amazing, within our agency, we have an amazing group that we've established, procurement, equity, and inclusion group that attends a lot of industry events and helps us spread the word about our upcoming opportunities for solicitations, like whether it's, you know, vehicle repairs coming up or HVAC services, right? Just helping through those industry events spread the word so we increase that base and participation from small businesses. The last but not least, posting the request for information. Request for information, for those who are not from a sort of procurement background, we're trying to basically, either it could be a survey or a list of questions that we usually post through webs. So any business that is interested can provide us the response and feedback about what a certain commodity, right, or service that we're looking to procure. And then what we started trying and testing out recently is posting draft solicitation, which in the beginning kind of made us really nervous. Like we were nervous, like, can we do this? Is it going to be potentially risky, right? Because us procurement folks historically been kind of trained as like, hey, everything is confidential when we're developing the solicitation, right? Like you shouldn't be letting people know, right? Because they might get an advantage if they have this sort of early knowledge about what the solicitation is going to be like. But if we're posting it through our official system, right, electronic bidding system, it is out there, right? It is publicly available to anybody who is interested. So it's not like one business gets a preview, right, when the other doesn't. And so we started posting the draft solicitation for comment, and it has been really helpful. It saved us in a lot of ways, in some instances where we got things corrected, right, before actually officially posting the solicitation and then having to amend it or pull it back, you know, after making changes. So it worked out really good the few times that we've recently tried it, and we're intending on continuing to do that and try that. The conflict that we hear from our customers a lot of times is like, well, all these new things that we now have to do and add to our competitive solicitation process, it's going to lengthen the time, right? It's going to, the competitive solicitation process has been complex enough. And now we're adding more things that we have to worry about and do, including, for example, like this, posting either RFI or draft solicitation. And so one of the things that we're trying to kind of manage and balance is that as the solicitation is going through internal reviews, for example, supervisor review, legal review, right, whatever your review process is in your organization, we're posting the draft solicitation with a disclaimer, like this is not a final product, right? This is still going through reviews. It's probably going to change and so forth. So we're trying to sort of stagger some of the to-dos, right? Rather than extending the timeline of the process as a whole. And so knowing, right, that there's that tension for us to complete the project as quickly as possible, complete the procurement as quickly as possible, while still trying to implement some of these things, right, that we want to do to increase supply diversity inclusion. So I'm going to take a quick pause, just check the chat. Okay, I think that's from the previous question. Perfect. So one of the things that it's not too early for us, right, in stage one to talk about is potential bias. And so we recently had a really good discussion with folks from another agency that talked about in our RCW, the law 3926 that talks about procurement, right, that agencies are subject to. It talks about agency being able to consider as part of responsibility bidders' previous work with the state, right? Quality of their previous work with the state. And so one of the questions that came up from an agency is like, well, that seems like we should be able to take into consideration as evaluators evaluating bids, for example, how they previously did on their previous contract with the state. And so one of the things that we're trying to here at DES sort of address is that, yes, that is technically true. We can take into consideration the quality of the service, but it shouldn't but it shouldn't bias how evaluators potentially, right, in how they evaluate merits of a certain, right, non-cost factor. And so, for example, I'll speak to it a little bit more, but there's different biases that we've kind of observed, right? Whether they're conscious or subconscious, they're from evaluators that we're trying to kind of minimize through some of these different techniques and tools that we're implementing at our agency. And part of it is kind of talking with evaluators up front, right, about what are the expectations, what is the process, what they should be aware and be mindful of. And I'll talk a little bit about it in the third stage about the evaluations a little bit more. But in this first stage, it's not too early to kind of think about things that could be potentially basically implicit bias, right? Like, for example, if we're doing market research and we're identifying businesses that we want to ask question about the commodity or service, it shouldn't be just the incumbent vendor. It shouldn't be just the large companies, right? We should be reaching out to those businesses that we haven't done business with, that are small certified businesses that can provide a different perspective, right? And rather than just keep asking questions of the folks that we've been doing business with historically. So again, kind of start thinking about, just like we talked about the supplier diversity inclusion weaves through the whole all the stages of the solicitation process, similar with the bias, but potentially risk of bias through the whole process, including kind of that stage one and how we work about identifying businesses that we want to reach out to, right, or do target outreach for. Some of the examples, just really quick, I'll touch on that because you'll see how it kind of applies later down in the stage is, you've probably heard that, like, halo effect or Horn's bias, Horn's effect, I'm sorry, or for example, contrast. So like when the bids are received and evaluators evaluate the bids, could they be potentially, right, biased by how the bid is presented? It's a Word document, there's typos, maybe English is a second language, right? There are issues on it versus a bid that comes in with fancy graphics, right? Fancy presentation, above and beyond. And who is more likely, right, to submit this fancy graphics, fancy paper bid, right? It's likely a larger business that has maybe the whole FTE dedicated to submitting bids versus a small business, right, that is trying to manage everything else and trying to find time to submit a bid. And we're trying to kind of caution our evaluators, right, are they potentially scoring a certain bid lower than the other just because of those sort of factors that technically are not part of the question, right? Or what we're looking for, that merit of what the question is for qualifications or performance requirements and so forth. So some of those biases, we just want to be aware, right, and continue to talk through and continue to sort of highlight. So we hopefully through that we minimize them, right, throughout the whole process. We have technically a group discussion planned. This is not a large group, so I would just encourage people to put things in the chat, and we'll go about it this way. If you've been part of the procurement process before, whether it's with the state or other organization, if you've seen a bias, an example of sort of even unconscious, sort of subconscious bias before, if you don't mind putting in the chat what you've observed, so the rest of us maybe can learn and also kind of acknowledge what some of us are seeing. So I'll give it a moment for people to, if they can think of any examples that they've experienced or seen, if you want to share with the group. Difficult to source from smaller entities. Yeah, a lot of, we hear that sometimes, right, from sometimes from our business, like business owners, right, of programs, is that they're worried that small business might not have the qualifications or capacity to do something. And we kind of have to talk through those concerns, right? Like, what are your performance requirements? What are your capacity needs, right? is it really true sometimes, right, that a small business we cannot let the small business grow, right, into supporting us as needed. But it does definitely depend on the project, right? Some projects are not maybe perfectly geared towards a small business, but that it's gonna bring us to the next point in stage 2, strategy development for solicitation. Yes, pressure to use a vendor or contractor from leadership. Yes, Brian, really good one. That one's actually was in the graphic before mentioned as well. We stepped away from using consensus evaluations because that's what we observed sometimes in the room when you bring evaluators in the room, right, and you try to get a consensus. And if you have a boss, right, in a room, a manager with a sort of a louder voice, it tends to go that way, right? And it's not necessarily ideal, right? And so that's one of the reasons we stepped away from doing sort of that consensus evaluation, and now just doing sort of independent evaluations and average scoring and so forth. But yeah, great example. Thank you. For small business. Yeah, great point. Janelle, sorry if I'm pronouncing your name hopefully correctly. Let's talk about it at the next stage, because definitely I hear you. We have that sometimes as well when we do our agency solicitation. All right. Well, if you think of any other sort of biases that you've experienced, or something that you want to share with the group of how you addressed it, let us know. Still put it in the chat. So stage 2, solicitation strategy. Couple of key points just to highlight. My main focus today, hopefully, is to share as much lessons learned as anything, because I feel like that's when I go to a presentation, that's the biggest value that I get, is like, okay, well, if they made that mistake, we can learn from that. So each perfect transition about what you guys were putting in the chat, right? Unbundling. Drew talked about it. The new supplier diversity statewide policy, right, talks about unbundling and encouraging us to unbundle. We've had some hard lessons learned on unbundling. Sometimes it works really well. We unbundle. We've basically successfully unbundled by region, for example, right? Either it's by county, or we have several versions internally saved for different region maps, whether it's 8 regions, dividing state in 8 regions, 5, 6 regions, so depending on a commodity and how a certain industry is structured, or by county, as I mentioned, if it's, for example, prevailing wage is a thing. And so we unbundled before successfully by region and by category. So category, for example, office supplies, right? So rather than just looking for a vendor that can offer all of the office supplies, we've unbundled by, let's say, paper, ink, right, and I don't know, writing tools, right? Things like that have worked out really well. But sometimes we've also found that it hasn't worked really well, where we tried to unbundle way too much and went too far. Recently, we've heard some feedback about our personal protective equipment, PPE solicitation, where we tried to unbundle to, like masks are separate from gloves, separate from hand sanitizer, and so forth. And so it also obviously complicates things for purchasers, and that is a constant tension that we have to try to find a good balance for, right? But the more we unbundle should hopefully increase the opportunity for small businesses that only focus on a certain product, right? So like if they only focus on face masks, if we didn't unbundle, they wouldn't be able to bid, right? We would have missed out on this amazing, potentially small business that focus only on masks. But if we unbundle too much, then our purchasers now, okay, so now I have to potentially do 3 purchase orders if I'm buying masks, gloves, and hand sanitizer, let's say, right? Just as an example. Now I have to do 3 purchase orders with 3 different suppliers. Yes, and it is, right, not, some folks, right, would say it's not efficient, and it could be, right, but that's sort of part of trying to increase, again, our spend with good certified businesses as much as we can, right? Kind of make good good traction in that area. So it's definitely something where we keep talking about, keep experimenting. A lot depends on the market research. The more market research we do, and then decide how it guides our unbundling decisions, right? What is too much, what is too little, and hopefully find a good right balance there. And sometimes we miss the mark, you know, I have to be honest with you guys. Investing additional effort into shaping requirements. So that has been, for us, I think, a really big improvement that we've implemented not long ago at our agency. Is historically we've had a very sort of basic one sentence requirement, like tell us about your customer service, right? Or something like that. And then each bidder, of course, kind of would talk about their interpretation of that question, right? Or they talk about this area of customer service, but not that, or they didn't expand on things that we really cared about. And so we kind of talked about, and that's an extreme example, but just to make a point. So we talked about reshaping them and spending a little bit more time in how we present the non-cost or performance requirements. So for those of you who are not from the procurement background, usually in competitive solicitations, there's a cost portion and then there's a non-cost portion. So those are usually qualifications, right? Their experience, their specifications, if it's a product, right? And so what we're trying to do now, and I'll skip ahead just as an example. This is not a perfect example by any means, just something that was convenient for me to grab to kind of illustrate the point, is that, you know, before this could have been probably one sentence, right? Just tell us about your program for child development and learning, right? Performances or something along those lines. But we tried to kind of expand to one, say what is kind of the expectation or what are we looking for, or at least provide some sort of a context to it, and then also provide a written response prompt. So rather than them guessing, right, the bidders guessing and each of them kind of guess differently about what are we looking for, we're trying to provide additional information. Okay, provide us this, this, and this, right, as part of your response to get the maximum points. So again, providing as much background, as much context as possible, and providing some prompts for what are you looking for if you're asking for some sort of a narrative response, right, that needs to be evaluated. The other thing that we've focused on when we talk about requirements, but non-cost requirements, is making them as much as possible pass or fail or objective where we can. So again, like that example about what is your customer service, rather than asking about what is your customer service, maybe it's broken down in tell us your customer inquiry response time, right? Like in hours, let's say, or days. Tell us your delivery time, right? In days or whatnot. And then there's a scoring matrix assigned to each. So we can basically assign points in an objective manner that is rather than subjectively, right, looking into long narrative responses. So the hosting pre-bid conferences, Drew talked about, it's a requirement. We've basically started, we've been doing them for a while. It's not mandatory for folks to attend the conference, but it's automatically added to all our competitive solicitations. We find that there's not much engagement usually from the bidders, but it is something where we come into the pre-bid conference with the slides. We have a slide deck that our team members fill out to provide basics about our agency, right? About what we do, what are we asking to procure, and basic about how we're going to evaluate and the next steps in the timeline. So even if we don't get a lot of engagement or questions, hopefully it's still very valuable for folks to listen about the procurement and learn about the procurement in that form, right? The lengthening the solicitation posting time, I know, again, it's a tension with customers. They're like, it's hard to tell the programs, sorry, we have to post it for usually at least 30 to 45 days to lengthen the process. They want their things that they want tomorrow, right? And that's usually a hard conversation to have, but it is something that we're aware, right? Especially for small businesses. They need time to respond. If we want that more engagement, especially from small businesses, lengthening the time, right, for the bidding is beneficial. And so we've been doing that basically automatically 30 to 45 days, depending on the complexity. and including the choice. Drew talked about the sheltered market option, right? 150,000 or below. That is something we haven't tried before the policy came about at Department of Enterprise Services. We're still piloting. We're learning as we go. There's still a lot to learn there. There's some risks that we have to acknowledge with that potentially. And so a lot will, there's a couple of options that we're considering, whether it is automatically we open it for any bidder, but if there's a qualified, basically responsible small business, small veteran business, right, they would get an award. Or if based on our market research, we find that the industry is dominated by small businesses, that we just say that, hey, this solicitation is only going to be for basically small business, small veteran businesses. So that is something we're still experimenting, still learning. So more to come. Hopefully next time we have these talk, we'll have more lessons learned there. Preference points, as Drew talked about, if you're using federal funds, not really an option for you. For us at our agency, we're able to use it for our agency procurements. We've used them for many years. It's been working great. And then the best option that we found producing really good results is actually reserved awards. So if you can do reserved award for small and veteran, whether it's, sort of add-on small portion of it, or for us on the statewide side, we started doing reserved awards for all our statewide contracts, basically automatically, and we're seeing great numbers, or numbers going up for small and certified businesses that we're able to award using that option. That's been working really well. We talked about this example. I'm going to skip group discussion just for the sake of time, because I already got a note that we only have a couple of minutes left. So we'll take a questions at the very end if I have a few moments, or if folks can stick around a little bit past. Stage 3, just really quickly to kind of skim through that slide, right? Evaluations, we touched on a lot of it. Talking with evaluators and having a kickoff meeting and instructions about bias, right? Increasing that awareness of what they should be aware, right, when they evaluate in terms of potential bias pitfalls. And then we added the certification for evaluators. We besides the typical, like, hey, do you have a conflict, or do you have to keep these bids confidential? We've added this section about diversity, equity, and inclusion in public contracting, with the requirement for our evaluators to take these short videos. These are links to UCLA videos. They're nothing sort of extreme. They're short, as you can tell, because we didn't want to add too much of a burden for our evaluators, but they cover the basics, again, for them to be aware of. And then we're posting winning bids for statewide contracts. If you are at an agency, one of the things we're looking to update our webs system to be able to post and to have documents accessible through webs, basically in that system after the fact, even after the bids closing. So we're right now working with our system folks to see if that can be a possibility for us. All right, this is just an example, and like I think we mentioned, we're going to be able to share tools with you guys after the fact, but this is an example of valid instructions. Like we talked about, we're trying to standardize for efficiency these type of instructions and tools that we use in our agency. Skipping group discussion again for the sake of time, and key takeaways, again, just to reiterate, supplier inclusion through the whole process of competitive solicitation. It's not just one thing, it's little things throughout the whole process, market research, outreach, right? And from then on, how you create a strategy, whether it's unbundling, right? How do you shape your performance requirements, right? And non-cost factors to make sure that you're not favoring, right, an incumbent business or other certain businesses. And then finding a right balance between standard processes and experimentation. For the efficiency, which we hope that the state and all agency kind of get along and use the same tools, right? When it comes to processes and templates, but also experiment where we can, where things that we can try, kind of like that sheltered market we talked about, continuing to experiment with what can we do there. And then invest in additional effort, right, into just your strategy development and crafting the requirements. And so those are the key takeaways. I have this bingo card for you guys. If you're sticking around, I'll leave it here while I look at the questions really quick in the chat. It's fall themed bingo card. So if you like this kind of thing, you can feel free to see if you can hit a bingo, and please brag about it in the chat. I'm going to check really quick to see if I can take any questions. I know we're at time or past time. But if you guys don't mind sticking around for just a moment, do you have an estimate of the percentage increase of state business that is being awarded to small and veteran-owned businesses? So I don't unfortunately have it for the state as a whole. Each agency obviously is tracking their own sort of data and reports. And I know that OMWBE, as Drew mentioned, they are coming up with some good kind of tracking and data reporting requirements. So I think we're moving there, where we can have goals and then we can track our sort of successful, hopefully, journey towards hitting those goals. But right now, I'm, at least in my level, I'm not aware of any sort of statewide ability to track that. For the statewide contracts that are within Department of Enterprise Services, we are tracking, and we are seeing an increase in awards, as I mentioned, in small and certified businesses that we're awarding our statewide contracts, which has been really exciting, and the increase in the spend on our statewide contracts with small and certified firms. So we can kind of see, right, that the agencies are trying to find those options and use those options. Where do we find the videos from UCLA on the prior slide? We will be able to email, at least we're told by Office of Equity Moderators, that we will be able to email you all the tools that we have, and a lot of them are also posted publicly on our website. So if you want to even go grab them today, if you go to des.wa.gov under contracts liaison, even if you search in the search, you should be able to get to the page where all these tools are posted publicly. But we are intending to share it afterwards, those tools. And sorry for talking so fast in the last 10 minutes. Hopefully got through most of you guys' questions. Thank you again for sticking around with us, and happy fall, everybody. Thank you. Bye.